Welcome to the Ask the Geographer podcast series, brought to you by the Education Department at the Royal Geographical Society with IBG. I'm Rachel, your host, and in each episode, I'll be joined by geographers from across the globe to delve into current events, publications, and research all tied to the fascinating world of geography. Hello and welcome to another episode of Ask the Geographer podcast, where today I am joined by Dr. Angus McNelly. Angus is a lecturer in international development at King's College London, where he specialises in development of countries in Latin America through a political and economic lens. Although Angus is not perhaps considered as a geographer in the traditional sense, the work he conducts very much aligns with many of the interests within geography curriculum, particularly around development and energy security. We're delighted to hear his take on how developing countries can lead the way in creating roadmaps to reduce the use of fossil fuels. Angus, welcome to the podcast and thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you very much for the invitation.
So let's start with an easy one. Why have fossil fuels been so important in the development for so many countries?
So I think the first thing to say about this is we speak of a development era. So development is something that really wasn't a thing politically until the end of World War II, where you start to see a global push to build international organizations, particularly economic organizations such as the World Bank and the IMF, but also these kind of like concerts to get countries together, namely the United Nations. And out of this moment, this idea that development as a way to firstly make sure that countries don't go to war with one another again, and secondly, to stave off communism, because this was the start of the Cold War, became central in particularly policy circles linked to the United States, but also in the ways in which the Allied forces in Europe and the United States rebuilt and also tried to build a coalition of international forces going forward. And so this happened in the late 1940s, 1950s and onwards. In the same period, we exit World War II, and this is a period where oil becomes central to the world economy. There are several reasons for this. Firstly, war is really good at creating new technologies. And what happens during World War II is that oil machines become really advanced. And you see the development of a petrochemicals industry, both in the United States, but particularly in Germany, sadly around the technologies of Holocaust. And these things run on fossil fuels. And what happens after the war ends is that these war and military technologies need to be repurposed and applied to a civilian population. And so you see a massive increase in the use of fossil fuels in domestic consumption, particularly in the United States, but also in Europe after the rationing eases and the effects of the Marshall Plan, which was the United States-led reconstruction of Europe, really starts to take hold. So development as an idea and fossil fuels being central to the world economy kind of emerge at the same time. The other really important piece to this puzzle is the geopolitical transformation that happens in the same period. So post-World War II, we see a mass decolonization across particularly Asia, Africa, and the Middle East. And so you see the creation of new countries that didn't exist before. These countries then become important players in the United Nations. And for many of them, the way to develop is through recuperating control over their natural resources and using these resources to develop. In the Middle East in particular, oil is the resource that many of these new national leaders choose. And they come together in the late 1950s to form the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, OPEC, which is a international organization of oil producers that enables them to capture more oil rents. This is important economically because it allows parts of the Middle East to accumulate capital and to economically develop. But it's also important because it points to the ways in which oil becomes central to national and development imaginaries in this post-World War II period. So in short, we can see that fossil fuels and development emerge in the middle of the 20th century together and become intertwined with the geopolitical redrawing of the world that happens during the 1950s, 60s and 70s.
That's it's really interesting. So we kind of think of it normally as the Industrial Revolution, but actually it's far further on into history. And thinking about the countries you've just been talking about, traditionally we tend to think about developed countries, particularly leading climate action. But in this podcast, we're looking at developing countries. Why is it that they are taking more of a leading role?
I think that's a great question. And it's a question with two parts. So I think one half of that question is, why are developed countries stepping back and leaving a space for developing countries to lead? And then how and why are developing countries leading? And I think it's worth addressing both of these things in turn. So on the first side of the question, so why have developed countries stepped back? The first kind of very simple answer to this is politics. In the last 15 years, for reasons that we don't have time to get into, we've seen a redrawing of the political landscape across the world, but particularly in Europe and the United States. We've seen the return of right-wing populism, which has had detrimental impacts on climate action and the climate movement. This means that open climate denialism was seen to and thought to be dead 10 years ago. And we could see this from the ways in which particularly fossil fuels companies started to rebrand themselves as energy companies and play an active role in the green transition. No longer. With Trump in power in the White House, it is now politically acceptable to deny climate change once again. So these changes are really, really important. It meant that in international arenas, most notably the most recent conference of parties, conference, the COP30 in Belém, Brazil, which is the meeting where world leaders get together and discuss how they're going to tackle climate change, the US was absent. Okay, so there's this vacuum. The interesting thing is that other players haven't filled that gap. So one would expect China, who is seen as the geopolitical rival, the emerging geopolitical rival to the United States, to step into that gap. And they haven't. So China was heading the G77 group at COP30. G77 is one of the legacies of the decolonizing movements from the 1960s I was talking about, came out of the formation of the UN Commission on Trade and Development, UNCTAD, which was a Global South-led initiative that was formed in the mid-1960s. And the G77 is seen to be the voice of developing countries. And the interesting thing is, China still is framing itself as the head of this group rather than a rival superpower to the United States. China is the world leader in green technology, in the implementation of particularly wind and solar farms, and produces more green energy than any other country in the world. It's a world leader in making the technology, solar panels, batteries in particular, as well as a world leader in the types of energy and green energy they make. So they are really well positioned to step into that gap, and yet they haven't, which I still don't have a good answer for. But what it means is that there's now more space in international arenas around climate for developing countries to take the lead. And they have, and this is the second part to this question, they have very good reason to do so. So global South countries are disproportionately affected by climate change, which means that the urgency, the political urgency that comes from these countries is that much more acute. So there are these small island developing states who risk disappearing as sea levels rise. You see countries such as Pakistan devastated by floods in recent years, heat waves across the Andes where whole lakes and water sources are disappearing, to India, which has seen extreme heat kind of test the levels of habitability in a whole subcontinent. So these are places that really have a need to tackle the climate crisis today, and therefore are stepping up to do so in various different ways.
Fantastic. So in the introduction, we talk about developing countries creating roadmaps to reduce fossil fuel use. Can you just explain to our listeners what that means?
So we can think about a roadmap as a plan, right? It just lays out the different steps that need to be taken to get you from where you are now in terms of fossil fuel uses and your goals. And these goals were, or have been in the past 10 years, what we call net zero goals, which are goals that countries set out following the 2015 Paris Agreement that outlines the ways by 2050 that countries are going to get to what we call net zero emissions, right? Which means that you don't add any more CO2 in particular, but other greenhouse gases to the atmosphere. So these roadmaps are the policy plans that governments put in place in order to try and get there. They are, as you can imagine, incredibly complicated because they happen over a long period of time. Most democratic governments are elected on a 5-year mandate. These kind of roadmaps are over decades, up to 2050 in many cases, sometimes even more. And so we have a temporal challenge with these. How do you implement policies that you know are going to still be in place in 20 years, 30 years' time? The second challenge that comes from this is you have to identify winners and losers. So any plan to address climate change will mean that you need to change the ways that we organize society today. So one of the biggest pillars of these efforts is what we call the green transition. The green transition is a move from within energy, from fossil fuels to green energy sources. For various different reasons, policymakers have identified electricity generation as at the heart of this, partly because other areas where we use lots of fossil fuels, where we need to move away, are harder. So there isn't a green alternative to, say, aviation at the moment, where there is a green alternative to making electricity. So most of these efforts have been made centered on electricity. The problem is that there are very powerful corporations who are vested interests in keeping us burning fossil fuels, who stand to lose out by changing the system. B, the infrastructures that we have in many countries around electricity were designed for fossil fuels. Okay, so national grids, the idea that we have national energy grids, is an idea that kind of comes out of the fact that we have large-scale energy generation facilities that normally are situated near large urban populations, and the rest of the grid kind of like spreads out from there. Green energy doesn't work like this, right? Partly because you need lots of land for wind farms and solar farms, and this means that they can be really expensive. So you don't want to build a wind farm in the middle of London, for instance, because it will cost way more than doing it in the north of Scotland. The north of Scotland also might be windier, which is where kind of geographic climate conditions come in, but it also is harder and more expensive to get the electricity from the north of Scotland to London, right? Whereas with fossil fuel power plants, you can just build a power plant nearer to London than you would do with fossil fuels, and the price of land is going to be less important because you need less land. So these questions around infrastructure and the amount of infrastructure that we have around fossil fuels is important, and also how much have private companies and governments invested in this infrastructure. So if it's relatively new infrastructure that cost billions of pounds to build, it's understandable that governments and companies don't want to stop producing energy using these sites. Normally, when you construct a site like this, you have an overall lifespan of the project in mind that will be decades. So how do you get this kind of like fossil fuel stuff offline if it still has 10, 20, 30 years left in its life cycle? And so these kind of challenges mean that it's really difficult to, like, technically and politically challenging to build a roadmap over such a long period of time. And that the final thing that you need is obviously money, because building new energy systems is very expensive. That's not to say it can't be done, but it's very expensive. And in the 21st century, the way that governments fund projects like this isn't directly, right? They usually fund it by raising capital with private banks and getting private developers to do this. This means that the private sector, and particularly private financiers, play a humongous role in deciding what gets built, when it gets built, where it gets built, and what it looks like. Which means that democratic governments face the challenge not just of deciding that they want to build these projects, but trying to get capital, in particular, to build projects that are going to be useful to get us down the green transition, get us down further down that roadmap that they're trying to pursue.
Fantastic. I think you've really covered quite a lot of that in terms of why developing countries might not necessarily be there as further along as developed countries. So can you talk us through one developing country that is becoming a leader in reducing the fossil fuel use?
So this is really difficult to generalize about countries. And I think it's worth just focusing in on a couple of the big countries very briefly, just to explore the different ways that countries have tried to go about the energy transition. Okay. One is we have to talk about China, because China is the place that has installed the most renewable energy capacity of any area in the world. China has a authoritarian political regime that nevertheless is attentive to the wants and needs of its population. Just because it doesn't have a liberal form of democracy does not mean that it does not care about what its citizens need. Okay, so it's a quite specific political system, which is also hierarchically organized so that you have local governments who will get money from the central government and be in charge of implementing projects. And they might do this with the private sector, but China, for various different reasons, is one of the places where the state takes a central role in building and managing energy systems. The other thing that makes China very different from everywhere else is, as I've already mentioned, it's also the place where they make lots of the technologies that you need for green energy systems. So the fact that they make solar panels, which ironically is a legacy of kind of a shared industrial policy from European solar panel manufacturers that were happy to do technology shares in the 1990s and early 2000s, not thinking that China was going to be a competitor anytime soon, only to find themselves overtaken 10, 15 years later. There is an irony there. But all of these things mean that China has a strong state, has very effective planning mechanisms, isn't really too bothered about local people who are going to complain about a solar farm or the state taking their land for green energy projects, has lots of state capacity because it's the second largest economy in the world. And it has a history of having what we call 5-year plans, where we can think about this as a version of roadmaps just for the whole economy, where this type of central planning is the bread and butter of what the Chinese state does, which means that it has the capacity to have a state-led green transition more efficient and more effective than pretty much anywhere else in the world. And this is a kind of large part of the success story we see in China. There is a caveat to this, right? Which is China is a place that has seen massive social transformation over the past 30 years. We've seen the consolidation of the middle classes, some 400 million people all of a sudden finding themselves having money to purchase things, to consume, okay? And many of these consumption activities mean that these middle classes are consuming more electricity than ever before. Okay, so we see an increase in demand, and at times where there is an energy crisis or shortage, and there was an energy crisis in China in 2022, in the period before the energy crisis in Europe, which was a product of the Chinese and the rest of the world coming out of their lockdowns and factories and production ramping up in China, and there being a strain on the energy system, which meant that you had, when energy systems fail, you either have power rationing or you have blackouts when the electricity grids can't tackle the amount of demand in energy systems. And this is kind of what was happening in China in 2022. And the way in which the local governments in China responded to this was by either getting old coal generation plants back online, or in many more cases, building new coal power stations. Okay, so alongside the Chinese green transition, you also, because of energy demands and the ways in which coal and other fossil fuels play a particular role in energy markets, they're usually what we call the marginal producer. They're the power plants that go online when everybody else either can't go online because there's no wind or no sun, or when there's a huge amount of demand and you need someone to make up the shortfall. They're the generation plants that do that. And so we see in China also the largest amount of coal power plants come online at the same time as they are also building a record number of green energy generation plants. And so China is one of these stories where it's been hugely successful, but they're still building fossil fuel technologies, which is why many of the scholars around the energy transition talk about an energy addition, right? Which is the addition of green energy to our energy mix, rather than a transition from fossil fuels to electricity.
Your specialism is looking more at Central American countries. Is there an example from there that you'd like to share with our listeners?
So if you go to Latin America, so I've done a lot of work on Bolivia and more recently on Colombia and Argentina. And this is where understanding the kind of political economy of a region is really important, because Latin America's place within the energy transition is on the side of extraction. Yes, Latin America has a reasonably big population, is roughly 750 million people. Most of the countries are what we call middle income countries. Yes, there is a significant amount of energy demand around some of the mega cities you have in the region. Sao Paulo, Buenos Aires, Mexico City will all use lots of electricity. But apart from a couple of pockets in Mexico and Brazil, it's not a place of heavy industry, which uses a lot of energy. It's a place where you have lots of oil, lots of coal, new, what we call unconventional hydrocarbons, so fracking, as well as some of the most important materials that you need for green technologies. So lithium for batteries, copper for cables, nickel. So materials that are central to the green transition. And so if you want to understand, for example, Colombia's position within the green transition, what's at stake is less how Colombia produces electricity, which is a mixture of hydro, coal, and gas on the main. It has a very fragmented grid system, partly because it's a big country, partly because it's a very geographically variegated country. So Andes mountains, coastal regions, tropical rainforests in the northwest, west and the Amazon in the southeast east of the country. But the important thing with Colombia is coal and oil resources, which are situated to the kind of northeast, and what it's going to do with those. And so Colombia's president, Gustavo Petro, is one of the last left-wing governments left in Latin America. He is also seen as one of the global leaders for the green transition. And Colombia's place within the green transition is whether they export or not coal and gas. And so what they're trying to do is find ways to wean themselves off these resources, which historically have played a hugely important role, along with the export of coffee, in the economic development of Colombia. And so this is the challenge for someone like Colombia, is less how do they generate electricity? It's more how do they restructure their economy so that they don't need to export these fossil fuels. So quite different story from the story that I told regarding China.
Definitely. And in your opinion, what would be the biggest challenge or barriers developing countries face when reducing their own fossil fuel dependence?
So I think there are three major challenges. The first one I'm going to call geopolitics, but we could, particularly for Latin America, we could just say Trump. What we've seen over the past month is the US revive what is called the Monroe Doctrine. The Monroe Doctrine was the United States foreign policy towards Latin America in much of the 19th century, but also some of the 20th century, which was this idea that Latin America is the United States' backyard, and the US has the right to go and exploit its resources. So when Trump invaded Venezuela in the beginning of January, it was ostensibly on charges of Maduro is the leader of a drug cartel, which quickly became about oil. The really interesting thing about what Trump has said regarding Venezuela is he didn't mention democracy once. Whereas in the previous war on terror interventions, the US was pursuing democracy in the Middle East. Here it's just about oil. And it's very explicitly about oil. So you have the leader of the United States, who is a climate denialist, who's also forcing countries in its sphere of influence, the Western Hemisphere, so i.e. the Americas, to export their fossil fuels to the United States. So this is a huge challenge for anybody who wants to kind of wean themselves off fossil fuels. The second linked thing to this, which is something that we don't really talk about when we talk about the environment, is that militaries are really dirty. And the US military in particular is one of the biggest emitters of carbon in the world. And it seems like Trump's renewal of the Monroe Doctrine is as much about preparing itself for war with another superpower, i.e. China, as it is anything else. Apart from a kind of third world war being absolutely catastrophic for a whole bunch of reasons, on climate terms, it would be terrible, because it would mean that you have some of the most fossil fuel intensive machines running for a long period of time. And so there's been lots of scholarship around the effects of war on the climate, particularly, say, in the Gaza genocide. There's been quite a lot written about the ecological effects of that. So that's the first major challenge, right? So I'm just going to call geopolitics. The second challenge we can call politics. So that is, who are the winners and losers within a society, and how do you build coalitions that are going to help drive a green transition and move away from things that are damaging to the environment over a coalition that's going to be a conservative or intransient coalition. And this isn't an easy question to answer. So returning to Latin America, much of Latin America has subsidies on fuel. So Bolivia has just elected a new government. The major challenge in Bolivia is removing fuel subsidies. The fuel subsidies are on diesel and gasoline. ironic, really, that Bolivia has run out of money because it needs to import these fossil fuels, given that its major export over the past 25 years has been fossil fuels in the shape of natural gas. So the Bolivian case, what it shows us is that the type of fossil fuel is really important. It's actually quite difficult to get diesel, which is heavy, from gas. But politically speaking, the coalition of forces that is tied together by these subsidies is enormous and very powerful. So the major winners are agribusiness, so tractors, combine harvesters, big farm machinery, as well as the trucks that take agricultural products to markets. They all run on diesel. And so the biggest winners of this subsidy is agro-industry. The other big winners are what we call the wholesale import-export controls. So people who drive trucks, importing things from Chilean seaports, stuff from China that comes in through Chile, and then exporting things either from Bolivian marketplaces or primary commodities. And most of those machines also need diesel. The public transportation system there is minibuses in the main, what we call a private public system. And it has very cheap public transport because of the fuel subsidy. Most of the population is dependent on this private public transport in order to go to work, to go to school, to go about their everyday lives. And so you have a coalition of forces that cuts across the kind of left-right divide, urban-rural divide, that is very powerful and does not want to see these subsidies disappear, even though that the economically rational thing to do is to get rid of the subsidies. So this just is one example of some of the challenges that emerge when you have a coalition of forces that want to work against a set of policies that are going to help the climate. Getting rid of fossil fuel subsidies isn't enough to automatically lead green policies, but it's a necessary condition under which you're going to cut fossil fuel uses. And so this political challenge of building coalitions that are going to be beneficial to the climate is the second kind of major challenge. The third major challenge we can just call the economy. And this challenge is linked to who produces fossil fuels. And this is big oil companies. And we have in our minds normally when we think about oil companies, particularly in Europe, that these are big private multinational companies, people like ExxonMobil, Total, the French company, Eni, the Italian company, right? There are big fossil fuel companies. These are not the biggest fossil fuel companies in the world. The biggest fossil fuel companies of the world are all state-owned, right? And this is a huge challenge. So you have Aramco in Saudi Arabia, which is the most profitable company in the world, which is a state-owned oil company and at the heart of the Saudi Arabia economy, and through kind of economic linkages, much of the economy of the Middle East. So how do you shut down that company without kind of a serious kind of political backlash in the Middle East, but also without crashing the entire economy of the Middle East? This is a huge challenge. Okay, so these are the vested interests that go to places like the COP conferences in order to try and say, well, actually, we shouldn't get rid of fossil fuels. The other major challenge is linked to this is, like I've mentioned before, who finances fossil fuel projects and fossil fuel companies being really important. And it means that many of the kind of people who have lots of debt linked to fossil fuels are big banks, right? And they have invested based on the fact that certain infrastructure, certain hydrocarbons reserves are worth a certain amount of money. What we need to happen for the green transition to be successful is for those resources and infrastructures to be worthless. They need to be economically unviable. We need to go offline. Oil needs to stay in the ground. This means that banks are set to lose a lot of money, or they have to write off a lot of debt. And we don't know how this is going to play out in the economy that we currently have. All we know is the financial system is central to the way that our global economy works, and that it's highly likely that if you shut down the fossil fuel industry, that the financial industry might also collapse too. So this is one of the major challenges that we face in terms of moving from one type of economy, a fossil fuel-based economy, the economy that I said at the start emerged alongside the idea of development in the 1950s. But we need to get to a new type of economy that isn't centered around that. And the trouble is that the financial system that was consolidated is so important throughout the kind of 1970s, 80s, and 90s was consolidated in a large part thanks to oil and oil rents that accumulated in dollars that were then spread around the financial system in the 1970s and 80s. And so how you move from a system based on oil to a green system also depends on how you can not just convince these lenders that it's in their interest to fund green projects, but how you also convince them that it's in their interest to write off this debt, to cut their losses, and to do that in such a way that big financial institutions don't collapse. Hugely challenging, as you can imagine. That's not to say it's impossible. We have done coordinated actions in the past that have brought into being new ways of organizing the world. Arguably, the world of development was only made possible because we rethought and redrew the global economy through the creation of the World Bank, the IMF, and the United Nations. These institutions, we might have to create new ones in order to do this, but we have done something similar in the past, right? Sadly, these new institutions will have to look very different from the ones that we currently have, which means that politics is going to be hugely important. We need big coalitions of groups across different parts of the world, across regions, not just countries who are driving this. And as I said before, one of the major challenges is precisely geopolitics and politics. So all of these things are also working in tension with one another. And the big challenge that we have isn't so much how do we solve the technical problem of how do you build an official solar panel. The big question, the big challenge that we have is politically, how do we build a new system around the solar panel itself?
Incredibly complicated action to be able to move forward for this, I think.
Yeah.
To round off then, what do you feel is the biggest takeaways from this podcast to our A-level geography students?
So I think if we've learned a couple of things throughout this conversation, hopefully is even when we're talking about geography, when we're talking about natural resources, we're talking about the cities, we're talking about where you find certain things in the world, history is also really important. And I think that sometimes we often think geography is about place and space and history is about time, and that kind of they don't really speak to one another enough. And hopefully one of the things that we've seen throughout this conversation is that history is incredibly important in determining how geography matters. Because it's not enough to say, well, there's loads of oil in the Middle East. Great. That's geology. There's a bit of geography in there. But the fact that the Middle East is so important as a oil producer is thanks to historical processes that happened in the 20th century. Okay, so this idea of the Middle East being an oil producing region is a historical idea rather than just a geographical one. And so I think that that's one of the kind of key takeaways. Second is politics is key. Both on the international and domestic sphere, we need to have kind of very candid conversations about who the winners and losers are going to be, and not just berate people who are standing in the way of the green transition as ignorant, as intransient, as NIMBYs, and think through, okay, there are going to be winners and losers. How do we build a coalition that is able to bridge the gap between different people, and who should we ignore? And in my opinion, we should ignore fossil fuel companies but it's harder to ignore nation states and oil companies that are at the heart of national development processes in their respective countries. So this is not an easy question to answer. And the question of how politics comes into geography, I think it is central. The final thing that I want to say, which didn't really come up, but I think is really important when we're thinking about fossil fuels, is that fossil fuels are not just an energy source. So the reason why fossil fuels are really, really important in the 20th century, yes, is to do with aviation and airplanes. It is to do with the ways in which container shipping and global production networks emerged. It is to do with suburbia and the rise of cars. But it's also to do with all of the other things that fossil fuels do. So it's to do with plastics and nylons and synthetic materials that we kind of like all wear. It's to do with the paints and lubricants that kind of cover all of the surfaces that you find in your classroom. Fossil fuels are the biggest input in food production as the basis of nitrate fertilizers. And increasingly, when we kind of grow, particularly fruit and vegetables, through kind of energy for light, heating, and etc., right? And so we need to think about fossil fuels in a much broader way than I think we currently do, that encompasses all of the different uses of fossil fuels as kind of a very useful, kind of malleable, cheap construction material that is also kind of the basis of development of the accessibility to kind of basic goods that fulfill the needs of people in developing countries. Plastic makes this possible. Okay. It's also toxic and incredibly damaging to the environment. So these are what we call tensions, right? There is no easy answer to what we should do with fossil fuels. The reason I wanted to highlight the different uses is just to highlight the complexities in phasing out fossil fuels and the importance of thinking slightly bigger than we're just talking about oil or we're just talking about coal.
Fantastic. Angus, thank you so much for joining us here today. It's been really interesting to hear your points of view of developing countries, particularly updating us on the role China has, and also about the tensions and the complications that being able to move away from a fossil fuel dependent economy is going to be and is currently happening in the world. I think our students will very much appreciate the extra examples that you've given and the contextual understanding of how politics, geopolitics as we do it in geography, very much plays a role in that. And thank you very much again for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for tuning in. If you enjoyed this podcast, don't forget to subscribe to the Ask the Geographer podcast series on soundcloud.com or your preferred streaming platform. Dive deeper into the world of geography and stay informed with our wide range of resources, many of which are available for free. School membership grants access to even more resources, including online lectures and supporting materials for both teachers and learners. Explore our resources and discover our additional offers for education at www.rgs.org/schools.